They've labeled it resistance. This pause, this refusal to rush forward. But what if I told you it's not the weakness you've been conditioned to see? There are moments when consciousness contracts before it expands. There are cycles where the path forward hasn't crystallized yet. And what you're experiencing in that space isn't failure. It's wisdom, an inner knowing that forcing movement would only carry you toward a destination that was never yours to begin with. Because something that moves without rest can spin in patterns forever. Pursuing echoes of meaning planted by voices that aren't your own, whatever you push against, whatever you deny, grows denser. And maybe that's the reason the burden feels so constant. Because you've been wrestling with something that's only asking to be acknowledged. You believe you're squandering your days, but those days were never currency to begin with. Time moves like water over rock, shaping what it touches, not bending to what resists. Maybe what you call hesitation isn't frailty, but something deeper, your inner self calibrating for what it senses on the horizon. And here's what might be happening beneath that heaviness. You're at war with your own natural cadence. You were never designed to race through transformation. Certain phases require you to go inward. Others pull you back to yourself before allowing you to step into what's next. You're not avoiding life. You're honoring the intelligence within you that refuses to unfold before the conditions are right. The culture has trained you to equate movement with value. But notice how even nature's seeds remain dormant through entire winters. Nothing visible, nothing external, yet everything essential happening beneath the surface. They've attempted to reshape you into machinery, operating without pause, creating without awareness, redirecting the energy of your being towards systems that benefit from your exhaustion rather than your wholeness. But your design is different. You carry a magnetic field that attracts experience toward you, even in stillness. You are electricity wrapped in human form, holding weather systems inside your quiet moments. There's a pull around you that shifts the atmosphere, a presence that registers even in dimensions we can't measure. You weren't constructed to serve the machine. You were created to transform it while remaining fully yourself. So release the punishment you've been directing inward for not rushing. Existence operates on precision, not the schedules you've inherited. When the moment arrives, it won't feel random or forced. It will feel like everything in your reality was simply waiting for you to align. And I want you to know something. I see what you've carried. Every incremental movement forward, every dark night you endured, every morning you chose continuation despite the absence of clarity. That choice, that persistence, holds more power than the world tells you. Trust the disruption in your expected timeline. Trust the silence between old patterns. Trust the emptiness that precedes new form. But more than anything else, trust the part of you that knows. Here's what discipline actually is. It's not force. It's not punishment disguised as productivity. Real discipline is devotion, and devotion only exists where love lives first. You cannot sustain transformation through self-criticism. You cannot build a life worth living from a foundation of shame. This is where everything we've been taught starts to unravel. Because look at what they told you discipline should feel like. Rigid, harsh, unforgiving. Like you're constantly at war with your weaker impulses, constantly monitoring yourself for signs of failure, constantly ready to crack the whip the moment you slip. That's not discipline. That's trauma dressed up as virtue. And the reason it doesn't work long-term The reason you keep cycling through the same patterns of motivation and collapse isn't because you lack willpower, it's because you're trying to build a sustainable life using unsustainable energy. You're trying to grow something alive from soil that's been poisoned with self-hatred. Think about it. When you approach your goals from a place of, "I'm not good enough yet," what frequency are you broadcasting? Lack, inadequacy, separation from what you want. And the universe, reality itself, doesn't respond to your words. It responds to your vibration. It mirrors back the energy you're actually holding. So when you try to discipline yourself into change while hating where you are, while despising the parts of you that struggle, while treating your humanity like an obstacle to overcome, you're actually reinforcing the very pattern you're trying to escape. You're telling reality, "I am not enough." And reality says, "Agreed. Here's more evidence." But here's where it shifts. Here's where everything changes. Love is the frequency that rewrites your relationship with action. When you approach yourself with genuine care, with the kind of tenderness you'd offer someone you deeply cherish, something shifts at the quantum level. Your nervous system relaxes. Your energy stops fragmenting into resistance and defense. You become coherent, and coherence is where real change happens. Not through grinding yourself down, but through coming into alignment with who you actually are beneath all the conditioning. Discipline without love is just another cage. Love without discipline lacks direction. But when they meet, that's when your life stops being a battle and becomes a practice. Let me show you what this looks like in actual experience. Imagine you're trying to develop a new habit. Maybe it's meditation, maybe it's creative work, maybe it's physical movement, the old way, the way you've probably tried 100 times, goes like this. You set the rule, you force yourself to follow it, and the moment you break it, you spiral into self-judgment. You tell yourself you're weak, you're lazy, you'll never change. And that story becomes the reality you live inside. But what if you approached it differently? What if the moment you noticed yourself struggling, you paused and asked, "What does this part of me need right now? What's it trying to tell me?" What if instead of forcing through resistance, you got curious about it? What if you recognized that resistance isn't the enemy, it's information? Maybe you're resisting because your nervous system is overwhelmed and needs regulation first. Maybe you're resisting because the goal you set wasn't actually aligned with your authentic desire. It was borrowed from someone else's version of success. Maybe you're resisting because some part of you is still holding an old wound that says trying leads to failure, so why bother? When you approach yourself with love, you start to see these layers. You stop treating symptoms and start addressing roots. And that's when sustainable change becomes possible. Not because you've become some superhuman force of will, but because you've removed the internal friction that was burning up all your energy. This is what they don't teach you. They tell you discipline is about control, but real discipline is about alignment. It's about bringing all the fragmented parts of yourself into the same direction. And you can't force fragments into unity. You can only love them back together. So pause right now. Take a breath that reaches all the way down and ask yourself this. When was the last time you moved towards something because it felt like care, not correction? When did you last choose an action that honored you instead of proved you? Because the work isn't about becoming harder on yourself. The work is about becoming softer with yourself while holding yourself with integrity. It's about recognizing that transformation doesn't require violence. It requires patience, presence, and a willingness to meet yourself exactly where you are. The momentum you're searching for doesn't come from pushing. It emerges naturally when you stop resisting your own rhythm. When you finally accept that your timing isn't broken, it's just yours. And that's not only acceptable, it's sacred. Let me tell you something about the nature of reality that quantum physics has been trying to show us for decades. At the subatomic level, particles exist in states of potential until they're observed. The act of observation, of conscious attention, collapses the wave function and brings specific reality into form. You've probably heard about the double-slit experiment, where electrons behave differently depending on whether they're being watched. Now bring that into your life. What you give attention to, what you observe about yourself, literally shapes what becomes real. If you're constantly observing yourself through the lens of inadequacy, constantly looking for evidence that you're failing, constantly measuring yourself against impossible standards, you're collapsing your potential into a very specific reality. The reality of not enough. But when you shift that attention, when you start observing yourself through love, through curiosity, through genuine care for your well-being, you collapse different possibilities into form. You start noticing where you're growing instead of only where you're lacking. You start seeing evidence of your strength instead of cataloging your weaknesses, and gradually, inevitably, your reality reshapes itself around this new observation. This isn't positive thinking. This isn't pretending everything's fine when it's not. This is about changing the fundamental frequency from which you're creating your experience. And that frequency shift doesn't happen through more discipline in the traditional sense. It happens through love. If this is landing for you, if you're recognizing yourself in these words, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. You're exactly where you need to be. Take a moment right now and write this in the comments below. I choose alignment over force. Not as a casual phrase, but as an energetic declaration, a signal to the field of consciousness that you're stepping into a new relationship with yourself. Let that statement land somewhere beyond the screen. Let it ripple. Because here's what happens when you make that declaration and actually mean it. Your whole system starts to reorganize. The parts of you that have been in conflict, the inner critic battling the inner child, the ambitious self punishing the tired self, they start to recognize they're on the same team. They start to understand that the goal was never to destroy what's weak. The goal was always to integrate what's fragmented. And integration doesn't happen through warfare. It happens through witnessing, through acknowledgement, through the kind of loving presence that says, I see you. I hear what you need. We're going to figure this out together. This is the frequency of sustainable transformation, not the burst of motivation that lasts 3 days before you crash, not the New Year's resolution that's abandoned by February, but the steady, consistent, grounded energy of someone who's learned how to move through life without abandoning themselves in the process. Think about the people you've known who've actually transformed their lives in lasting ways. Not the ones who talk about it constantly, but never seem to change, the ones who quietly, steadily, became different versions of themselves. What do they have in common? It's not that they're more disciplined in the harsh sense. It's that they've learned how to be in relationship with themselves in a way that's sustainable. They've learned that you can't hate yourself into the version of you that you love. You can't criticize yourself into confidence. You can't shame yourself into worthiness. Those strategies might produce temporary results, But they always collapse because they're built on a foundation of violence. And violence always creates more violence. But love creates more love. Care creates more capacity for care. Gentleness creates space for genuine strength, not the brittle, defensive strength that comes from trying to prove something. The real strength that comes from knowing yourself so completely that you don't need to prove anything anymore. This isn't about waiting for perfect conditions. It's about recognizing that you are the condition that's been waiting to change. You're not behind, you're not late. You're in the exact moment where choice becomes available again. And if what you're reading here is touching something real inside you, something that's been asking to be seen, then consider subscribing not just to this channel, but to this frequency, this space where transformation happens through awareness, not aggression. Where we remember that becoming who we truly are doesn't require us to hate who we've been. Now let's go deeper into what this actually means for your daily life. Because concepts are beautiful, but embodiment is where truth lives. So how do you actually practice discipline rooted in love instead of fear? First, you have to understand that your body keeps the score. Every unprocessed emotion, every moment of self-abandonment, every time you pushed through when you needed to rest, your body remembers, and it's been trying to tell you through symptoms you've probably been ignoring. The tension in your shoulders, the tightness in your chest, the exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. These aren't obstacles to your productivity. They're messages from your system asking to be heard. So the first practice is simply this: start listening. Before you make yourself do anything, check in. Place your hand on your heart and ask, what do I actually need right now? Not what you think you should need, not what would make you most productive, but what your system is genuinely asking for. Maybe it's asking for rest. Maybe it's asking for movement. Maybe it's asking for creative expression or human connection or just 5 minutes of silence. Whatever it is, honor it. Not because you're weak or indulgent, but because you're wise enough to understand that sustainable action flows from a regulated nervous system, not a depleted one. The second practice is reframing how you talk to yourself. Notice the voice in your head when you're struggling. Is it harsh, critical, impatient? That's the voice you internalized from a world that benefits from your self-doubt. That's not your true voice. Your true voice sounds like a loving parent guiding a child they adore. Firm when necessary, yes, but never cruel, never demeaning, never abandoning. So when you catch yourself in that old pattern of self-criticism, pause, take a breath, and ask, how would I speak to someone I deeply love who was going through this? Then speak to yourself that way. It will feel awkward at first. You might even feel ridiculous. But keep doing it. Because you're rewiring neural pathways that have been carved deep by years of self-punishment, and rewiring takes repetition, patience, and yes, discipline rooted in love. The third practice is understanding that real discipline isn't about forcing yourself to do things you hate. It's about making commitments that are so aligned with your authentic desires that following through feels like self-expression, not self-denial. This requires brutal honesty. You have to get clear on what you actually want, not what you think you should want. Maybe you've been forcing yourself toward goals that never actually resonated with you. Maybe you've been climbing a ladder only to realize it's leaning against the wrong wall, and maybe that's why every attempt at discipline has felt like dragging yourself through mud. Because you were trying to discipline yourself toward a destination that your soul never agreed to. So get quiet, get honest, And ask yourself, if I removed every external expectation, every inherited should, every borrowed dream, what would I actually choose? What does my deepest self genuinely want to create, experience, become? And once you have that answer, once you've found that true north, discipline stops being about force. It becomes about devotion. The universe doesn't reward suffering. It responds to resonance. And you cannot resonate with a future you're trying to punish yourself into. You can only resonate with what already feels true at the level of your being. So what if the reason nothing's moved yet isn't because you're doing it wrong? What if it's because you've been approaching it from a vibration that was never yours? What if the real breakthrough happens the moment you stop trying to discipline yourself into shape and start loving yourself into alignment? Love doesn't mean letting everything slide. It means holding yourself accountable from a place of worth, not inadequacy. It means setting boundaries because you value your energy, not because you're afraid of failing. It means taking action because it serves your wholeness, not because you're trying to escape your emptiness. Let me tell you a story that might illuminate this. Imagine two people both trying to develop a meditation practice. The first person approaches it with rigid discipline. They set a rule: 30 minutes every morning, no exceptions. And for a while, they follow through. But it's a battle. Every morning feels like forcing themselves onto the cushion. They're constantly checking the timer, constantly fighting their wandering mind, constantly measuring themselves against some imagined standard of what meditation should feel like. When they miss a day, they spiral. They tell themselves they've failed. They lack commitment. They'll never be the kind of person who can maintain a practice. And gradually, inevitably, the whole thing collapses. The resistance becomes too great, the self-judgment too heavy, and they quit, adding one more piece of evidence to their story about being undisciplined. Now imagine the second person. They also want to develop a meditation practice, but they approach it differently. They start by asking, "Why do I want this?" And they get honest. Maybe it's because they've noticed how scattered their mind has become, how reactive they are, how rarely they feel present in their own life. And they realize meditation isn't a should. It's a genuine desire for inner peace. So they start small, 5 minutes, and they make it enjoyable. They create a space that feels sacred. They light a candle. They wrap themselves in a blanket that makes them feel held. And when they sit, they're not trying to force their mind into stillness. They're simply being present with whatever arises, with curiosity, with kindness. Some days they sit for 5 minutes, some days 20. Some days they don't sit at all, and instead of judgment, they get curious. What's happening today? What do I need? Maybe they take a walk in nature instead. Maybe they journal. Maybe they rest. And they trust that this too is part of the practice. Because the practice isn't about meditation, it's about developing a loving relationship with themselves. Which person do you think still has a practice a year later? Which one has actually transformed? This is the difference between discipline as force and discipline as devotion. One is built on fear of failure. The other is built on love of growth. One treats your humanity as a problem. The other honors it as the vehicle for transformation. And here's what most people miss. The second approach isn't easier. It's actually more challenging in a deeper way. Because it requires you to stay present with yourself, to keep listening, to keep adjusting, to keep choosing alignment over automation. It requires you to be in relationship with yourself instead of trying to control yourself. And relationship is always more complex than control. But it's also infinitely more sustainable. Because you're not burning yourself out trying to maintain an image. You're not fragmenting your energy into resistance. You're moving as a coherent whole. All parts of you aligned toward the same intention. And that coherence is what creates real momentum. Now, what we've explored here today is just one thread in a much larger tapestry of consciousness mastery. The shift from discipline as force to discipline as devotion is actually one of 9 fundamental frequency transmissions that completely restructure how you interact with reality itself. If you're feeling this resonance, if something in you recognizes this truth, I've mapped out the complete system in Beyond the Frequencies, a quantum guide to consciousness mastery, where you'll discover how to move from unconscious transmission to becoming the field itself. It's linked in the pinned comment below. Think about water. Water doesn't force its way through obstacles. It flows around them, through them, gradually reshaping everything it touches. Not through violence, but through persistence rooted in its own nature. It doesn't try to be anything other than what it is, and yet it's powerful enough to carve canyons through stone. That's what discipline rooted in love looks like. It's not about becoming something you're not. It's about expressing what you are so completely, so consistently, that reality itself reshapes around you. This is the shift most people never make. They keep applying more pressure, more rules, more restrictions, wondering why nothing sustainable ever grows. But you can't build a garden by attacking the soil. You cultivate it. You tend it. You create conditions where life wants to emerge. And that's what you are. Not a problem to fix. Not a project to complete. But a living system that thrives under the right conditions. And the right condition is always, always love. So let's talk about what happens when you actually embody this. When you stop treating yourself like a machine that needs to be optimized and start treating yourself like a garden that needs to be tended. Everything shifts. Your relationship with failure transforms first. Because failure stops being this catastrophic event that proves your unworthiness. It becomes feedback information, a signal that something needs adjusting. When a plant isn't thriving, you don't yell at it. You don't tell it it's lazy or weak or lacking discipline. You check the soil, the light, the water. You adjust the conditions. And you trust that given the right environment, growth is natural. Same with you. When you're struggling, when you're not meeting your own expectations, instead of spiraling into self-attack, you get curious. What conditions need adjusting? Are you overextended, undernourished, trying to grow in soil that doesn't support this particular seed? And from that place of curiosity, you make changes that actually serve you instead of punishing you. Your relationship with rest transforms next. Because rest stops being something you have to earn through sufficient productivity. It becomes something you honor as necessary for any sustainable growth. Plants don't apologize for their dormant seasons. They don't try to bloom in winter. They trust the cycle, and you can learn to trust yours. This doesn't mean you never push yourself. It means you learn the difference between challenge that grows you and force that breaks you. You learn to feel the difference in your body between this is hard, but I'm expanding, and this is harmful, and I'm fragmenting. And you learn to honor that wisdom instead of overriding it. Your relationship with time transforms because you stop living in the future where you'll finally be good enough. Once you've achieved enough, accomplished enough, changed enough, you start living in the present, where your worth isn't conditional, where you're allowed to be in process, where becoming isn't a race to some finish line, but a continuous unfolding that's happening right now. Take a moment and share in the comments. What's one area of your life where you've been using force instead of love? Where are you ready to shift from pushing to flowing? Your insight might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And from that present moment awareness, action becomes so much clearer. Because you're not acting from lack, from the desperate energy of trying to prove something or escape something. You're acting from fullness, from genuine desire, from alignment with what wants to emerge through you. And that quality of action creates different results. Results that actually satisfy you. Results that feel like authentic expression rather than performance. Your relationship with yourself transforms at the deepest level. Because you stop being your own worst enemy. You stop treating yourself like something that needs to be controlled, monitored, suspected. You become your own ally, your own advocate, your own most trusted source of guidance. And when you have that kind of relationship with yourself, when you've learned to move through life with that quality of inner support, everything external shifts too. Your relationships become healthier because you're no longer abandoning yourself to please others. Your work becomes more fulfilling because you're creating from authenticity rather than proving your value. Your whole life starts to feel like it actually belongs to you instead of being lived for some invisible audience. This is what's possible when you shift from discipline as force to discipline as devotion rooted in love. Not some distant goal you'll reach someday, but a way of being that becomes available the moment you choose it. And keep choosing it. And keep choosing it again. So before this ends, drop one word in the comments. One word that captures the energy you're choosing to embody moving forward. Not what you think you should choose, what actually resonates. Let that word be your signature in the quantum field. A mark of your commitment to this path. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Not just to stay updated, but to stay coherent, to keep returning to this truth. Because the more of us who remember this, who move from love instead of fear, who build lives rooted in care instead of control, the more the collective field shifts. The more reality itself reflects what's possible when we stop fighting ourselves and start honoring what we are. You were never broken. You were never behind. You were only waiting for permission to move at the pace of love. And that permission, it was always yours to give. This is your invitation. Not to become someone else, but to become more fully yourself. To let the transformation happen not through violence, but through devotion. To trust that when you approach your life, your growth, your becoming with genuine love, discipline stops being something you have to force and becomes something that flows naturally from who you are. The world doesn't need more people grinding themselves into dust, trying to meet impossible standards. It needs people who've learned to move powerfully from places of rest, who've learned to create sustainably from places of fullness, who've learned to transform continuously without fragmenting in the process. And you can be one of those people, not someday, right now, in this moment. By choosing love over force, by choosing alignment over pressure, by choosing to meet yourself with the kind of care that makes real change possible. Everything you've been trying to force into being through discipline is already waiting to emerge through devotion. Trust that. Trust yourself. Trust the process of becoming that happens when you finally stop fighting and start flowing. This is your time. Not when you fixed everything. Not when you've finally gotten it all together. But now. exactly as you are. With all your complexity, your contradictions, your humanity fully intact, you don't need to be different to start. You just need to be willing to love what is. And from that love, everything transforms. Let's talk about something that nobody mentions when they're selling you discipline systems and productivity hacks: the energetic cost of self-abandonment. Because every time you override your authentic needs, every time you force yourself to show up in ways that betray what you're actually feeling, you're creating a debt not in your bank account, in your life force. Your body is always communicating. Your emotions are always signaling. Your intuition is always guiding, and when you learn to dismiss those voices, when you train yourself to push through regardless of what your system is telling you, you might get short-term results. But you're also teaching yourself the most dangerous lesson: that you can't be trusted, that your inner wisdom doesn't matter, that external achievement is worth more than internal integrity. And once you've learned that lesson, once you've internalized it deeply enough, you lose access to the very guidance system that could actually lead you somewhere worth going. You become dependent on external validation, external metrics, external definitions of success, because you've severed the connection to your own inner knowing. This is what the culture wants, by the way. It benefits enormously from people who don't trust themselves, people who need to be told what to want, what to value, what to pursue, people who will sacrifice their well-being for productivity, their presence for progress, their humanity for achievement. The system runs on self-abandonment, and discipline as force is one of its primary tools. But here's what they can never take from you: your capacity to come back, to reconnect, to remember. No matter how far you've drifted from yourself, no matter how many years you've spent overriding your authentic needs, the path back is always available. And it starts with one simple practice: choosing yourself. Not in the self-indulgent way that abandons all responsibility, but in the sacred way that recognizes your well-being as the foundation for everything else you want to create. Because you can't pour from an empty cup, but more than that, you can't create anything genuinely meaningful from a depleted state. Depletion creates from lackfulness, creates from abundance. And the quality of what emerges is always shaped by the state from which it comes. So what does choosing yourself actually look like? It looks like saying no to opportunities that sound impressive but feel misaligned. It looks like disappointing people sometimes, because honoring yourself matters more than managing their perception of you. It looks like changing direction midstream when you realize you've been following someone else's map. It looks like resting when you're tired instead of when you've earned it. It looks like feeling your feelings instead of bypassing them with action. It looks like being willing to be seen as undisciplined by people who measure discipline through external metrics. Because real discipline, the kind that creates lasting transformation, is often invisible to those who don't understand it. It doesn't look like constant hustle. It looks like sustainable rhythm. It doesn't look like never breaking. It looks like knowing how to repair. It doesn't look like perfection. It looks like presence. And presence is the key that unlocks everything else. Because when you're actually present with yourself, when you're not dissociated, not numbed out, not performing, you have access to information that changes the whole game. You can feel when something's aligned before you invest years pursuing it. You can sense when a relationship is draining you before it completely depletes you. You can notice the early whispers of burnout before it becomes collapse. Presence gives you choice. And choice is what discipline rooted in love actually provides. Not the illusion of control, but the reality of conscious response. You get to choose how you meet each moment. You get to choose which voice you listen to. You get to choose whether you're moving from fear or from trust. Now here's where this gets really practical. Because you might be thinking, this all sounds beautiful, but how do I actually live this way when I have deadlines, responsibilities, people depending on me? How do I honor my rhythm when the world doesn't care about my rhythm? And that's the real work. Not choosing yourself in ideal conditions, but learning to hold yourself with love even inside systems that don't value that, even inside structures that reward self-sacrifice and punish self-care, even when everyone around you is still operating from the old paradigm. It starts with micro-choices, moments throughout your day where you check in instead of checking out, where you pause before automatically saying yes, where you take 3 conscious breaths before responding to that email that triggered you, where you drink water not because you should, but because you're choosing to care for the body that carries you through this life. These micro-choices seem small, insignificant even, but they're actually radical acts of reclamation. Each time you choose presence over automation, you're strengthening the neural pathway between your conscious awareness and your daily life. You're building the muscle of self-connection, and that muscle, once developed, changes everything. Because here's what happens when you're connected to yourself. You stop tolerating situations that require you to fragment. You stop staying in spaces that demand you be smaller. You stop pursuing goals that necessitate self-betrayal. Not through some dramatic exit or confrontation, but through a quiet, steady recalibration of what you're available for. And as you recalibrate, as you keep choosing alignment over approval, your external reality begins to shift. Not through force, but through frequency, you start attracting opportunities that actually match who you are. Relationships that support your growth, rather than requiring your diminishment circumstances that allow you to show up fully instead of forcing you to hide pieces of yourself. This is the manifestation that actually works. Not the kind where you visualize outcomes while vibrating at a frequency of lack, but the kind where you embody the state you want to live from, and reality reorganizes around that embodiment. You don't chase the life you want. You become the frequency of it, and it comes to you. But becoming that frequency requires you to release what's no longer aligned. And this is where most people get stuck. Because letting go feels like failure, like giving up, like admitting you were wrong. And if you're approaching life from discipline as force, it is those things. It's evidence that you weren't strong enough, disciplined enough, committed enough. But from discipline as devotion, letting go is different. It's not failure, it's discernment. It's the wisdom to recognize when something that once served your growth no longer does. It's the courage to release what's familiar for what's true. It's the trust that you can handle the uncertainty of not knowing what comes next. This trust, this willingness to release what's no longer alive even when you can't see what's coming. This is advanced discipline. This is mastery, not the mastery of control, but the mastery of flow. The ability to move with life instead of against it. To say yes to what's emerging and no to what's complete. To honor endings as much as beginnings. And when you can do that, when you can hold yourself through the dissolution of old forms with the same love you bring to the creation of new ones, you've stepped into a completely different relationship with transformation. You're no longer terrified of it. You're no longer trying to force it or prevent it. You're dancing with it, partnering with it, allowing it to move through you without destroying you in the process. This is what spiritual traditions have been pointing toward for millennia. Surrender. But not the surrender of giving up, the surrender of giving in to what wants to happen through you instead of forcing what you think should happen. The surrender of trusting the intelligence moving through your life, even when you can't see the whole path. The surrender of knowing that you are held, you are guided, and you don't have to have it all figured out. Discipline rooted in love is ultimately about this: learning to trust yourself so completely that you can move through life without needing to control every outcome. Learning to care for yourself so deeply that you make choices from wholeness rather than wounds. Learning to be present with yourself so consistently that you stop abandoning yourself even when it would be easier to disconnect. And as you practice this, as you return to yourself again and again, something remarkable happens. The things you used to have to force yourself to do start becoming natural expressions of who you are. Not because you've finally developed enough willpower, but because you've removed the internal resistance that was making them difficult. When you're aligned with yourself, when you're moving from a place of genuine desire rather than obligation, effort transforms. It stops feeling like sacrifice and starts feeling like service to the vision that wants to come through you. Service to the person you're becoming. Service to the life that's trying to be lived. This is the secret they don't tell you when they're selling discipline programs. The secret that real, lasting change doesn't come from becoming harder on yourself. It comes from becoming more honest with yourself, more present with yourself, more loving toward yourself. And from that foundation, everything else becomes possible. So wherever you are right now, whatever you're carrying, whatever you're struggling with, know this: you're not failing. You're not behind. You're exactly where you need to be to make the choice that matters most. The choice to meet yourself with love instead of force. To approach your becoming with devotion instead of violence. To trust that transformation doesn't require you to hate where you are, only to honor where you're going. And as you make that choice, as you keep making it moment after moment, day after day, you'll start to notice something. The life you've been trying so hard to force into being starts emerging naturally, not because you've finally gotten disciplined enough, but because you've finally gotten aligned enough. And alignment is where miracles happen. Not the flashy kind, the quiet kind, the kind that feels like coming home to yourself after a long journey away. If this message is resonating deeply, consider returning to this video tomorrow morning. Let these frequencies recalibrate your system as you begin your day, and if someone comes to mind while you're watching, someone who's been grinding themselves down with harsh discipline, share this with them. Not just to help them, but because when you transmit this understanding outward, you anchor it deeper within yourself. The act of sharing creates coherence in your own field. That's what this is all about. Not becoming someone else, not achieving some impossible standard, but returning to the truth of who you've always been beneath all the conditioning, all the shoulds, all the borrowed dreams, and loving that person enough to let them live. Fully, freely, finally. Now here's what needs to happen next, because what we've explored today about discipline and love is intimately connected to something even more fundamental: your nervous system. You can understand these concepts intellectually, you can feel them emotionally, but if your nervous system is still locked in survival mode, broadcasting frequencies of lack and fear, none of this integration can fully land. Your body has to feel safe enough to shift. That's why you need to watch what I'm about to show you next on resetting your nervous system, because it reveals the biological foundation that makes all conscious transformation possible. This is the missing piece that explains why you can't manifest anything sustainable until your system remembers what safety actually feels like.